Hello, everybody. Welcome to Boswell Book Company's virtual event series with Books and Company, together known as Readings from Milwaukee, featuring Lisa Baudoin from Books and Company. And I'm Daniel from Boswell, and I'm just welcoming you to our event today. It is for Boswell, it's day 4,940. We have some wonderful virtual events coming up from the series, but they're all sort of in negotiations. So I know that both of us have a pretty dynamic schedule going on. Ours is at boswellbooks.com and Lisa's is at booksco.com. She'll tell you more about a couple of things coming up and then introduce our author. I present to you Lisa Baudoin.
Wait, I don't know what I could tell you what we have coming up other than tomorrow we'll be at the Sharon Lynn Wilson Center for their literary lunch, there's a word. And then the Festival of Books is coming up as well. So we're really excited about that. But today we are in conversation with Joanna Quinn for her new novel, The Whalebone Theatre. And Joanna was born in London. She grew up in Dorset in the southwest of England, where her debut novel, The Whalebone Theatre, is set. I could not agree more with the London Sunday Times, or the Sunday London Times, when they wrote, "Honestly, I want to sound a trumpet and pull out some flags. The Whalebone Theatre is pure heaven from first word to last." The New York Times calls Quinn's imagination and an adventuresome spirit an absolute pleasure to behold. And it's also been selected for the Today Show Read with Jenna Book Club, which is quite a big deal for books and also for a first novel. That's exciting for us. Joanna Quinn has worked in journalism and in the charity sector. She is also a short story writer published by the White Review and Common Press, among others. She teaches creative writing and lives in a village near the sea in Dorset, which is beautiful. So welcome, Joanna. We're really excited to have you today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
And do you want to start a little bit by giving us maybe your elevator pitch and then read to give us a flavor of the story of the novel?
Okay, I'm famously bad at the elevator pitch.
Oh, no.
I lean very hard on my publicity people to do that for me, but it is a novel that starts at the end of the First World War, finishes at the end of the Second World War, follows a single family, the Seagraves, through that time, particularly the younger generation, 3 children who become young adults by the time the Second World War breaks out. And there's a whole cavalcade of interesting characters that they meet along the way, one of which is an enormous dead whale. That's my elevator pitch.
Good one.
So I thought I would read, because it's quite hard to read from the book without giving too much away. But I thought I'd read the very opening, the very start of the book, which starts in December 1919 in Dorset. And if you don't know where Dorset is, it's on the south coast of England, right at the bottom, overlooking the English Channel. And this is my all new American hardback, which I got in the post today. So that's very exciting. Okay. The last day of the year. Christabel picks up the stick. It fits well in her hand. She is in the garden, waiting with the rest of the household for her father to return with her new mother. Uniformed servants blow on cold fingers. Rooks caw half-heartedly from the trees surrounding the house. It is the last day of December, the dregs of the year. The afternoon is fading and the lawn a quagmire of mud and old snow, which 3-year-old Christabel stamps across in her lace-up leather boots. Holding the stick like a sword, a miniature sentry in a brass-buttoned winter coat. She swishes the stick to and fro, enjoying the whoop whoop sound it makes, uses it to spoon a piece of grubby snow to her mouth. The snow is as chilly on her tongue as the frost flowers that form on her attic window, but less clinging. It tastes disappointingly nothingy. Somewhere too far away to be bothered about, her nanny is calling her name. Christabel puts the noise away from her with a blink. She spies snowdrops simpering at the edge of the garden. Whoop, whoop. Christabel's father, Jasper Seagrave, and his new bride are at that moment seated side by side in a horse-drawn carriage, travelling up the driveway towards Jasper's family home, Chilcombe, a many-gabled, many-chimneyed, ivy-covered manor house with an elephantine air of weary grandeur. In outline, it is a series of sagging triangles and tall chimney stacks, and it is huddled on a wooden cliff overhanging the ocean for 400 years. Its leaded windows narrowed against sea winds and historical progress, its general appearance one of gradual subsidence. The staff at Chilcombe say today will be a special day, but Christabel is finding it dull. There is too much waiting, too much straightening up. It is not a day that would make a good story. Christabel likes stories that feature blunderbusses and dogs, not brides and waiting. Voop! As she picks up the remains of the snowdrops, she hears the bone crunch of gravel beneath wheels. Her father is the first to disembark from the carriage, as round and satisfied as a broad bean popped from a pod. Then a single foot in a button boot appears, followed by a velvet hat, which tilts upwards to look at the house. Christabel watches her father's whiskery face. He too is looking upwards, gazing at the young woman in the hat, who, while still balanced on the step of the carriage, is significantly taller than him. Christabel marches towards them through the snow. She's almost there when her nanny grabs her, hissing, "What have you got in your hands? Where are your gloves?" Jasper turns. Why is the child so dirty? The dirty child ignores her father. She is not interested in him. Grumpy, angry man. Instead, she approaches the new mother, offering a handful of soil and snowdrop petals. But the new mother is adept at receiving clumsy gifts. She has, after all, accepted the blustering proposal of Jasper Seagrave, a rotund widower with an unmanageable beard and a limp. "For me," says the new mother, and it is not a question. How novel. She steps down from the carriage and smiles, floating about her a hand which comes to rest on Christabel's head, as if that were what the child is for. Beneath her velvet hat, the new mother is wrapped in a smart wool travelling suit and a mink fur stole. Jasper turns to the staff and announces, "Allow me to present my new wife, Mrs. Rosalind Seagrave." There is a ripple of applause. Christabel finds it odd that the new mother should have the name Seagrave, which is her name. She looks at the soil in her hand, then turns it over, allowing it to fall onto the new mother's boots, to see what happens then.
Christabel is one of my favorite characters. All the way through, she's so interesting and it's refreshing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, she was really fun to write, actually, all the way through. She's she kind of came fully formed.
I'm curious, was she, I mean, it feels like, and some critics have said, you know, because it's effectively about the three kids,
yeah,
but she seems to sort of overwhelm the story. Was that always your intention? Did you start with Christabel, or was in the writing, did you see this path?
No, I kind of had like two run-ups of the story, both of which, well, one of which featured a kind of present day framing narrative, where I think that's probably a fairly common mistake in beginner writers, that you think, you know, you want to write an old story, but you think you have to start it in the present day and someone journeys back into the past. So I did that for a little while and then I got rid of that. And then I started actually further back with Jasper, Christabel's father, as a child. And you still see some remnants of that. They sort of get, I didn't throw all of them away, they get reused later in the book. But I showed it to someone fairly early on and she said, "Oh, I'm much more interested in the women characters. Can you try starting it with them?" So I already had that scene where Christabel's waiting for the arrival of her new mother. And as soon as I put it at the front, I thought, oh, this feels really interesting. And then even then I sort of had in my head that it was going to be a multicast book, that there were going to be lots of people in it with maybe not one definite character. But every time I tried to move away from Christabel, the energy kind of fell away. So it was like as soon as I'd introduced her, that it was fairly clear that she was the central thread, if not the central. She is sort of the central character, I think. But yeah, there are still lots of others. But yeah, she more by accident than design, actually. But
well, she's like the center of a wheel in which all the spokes come out and it spins all around. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Exactly. Yeah, and I think it is nice. I think I don't really know what I was thinking where I thought I could manage a massive cast of characters, because that's quite tricky to do if you haven't got one single person that's kind of leading you through it. And it was nice to have her, because she is a leader in her character, even within her siblings. She's the natural leader. So it felt nice that she should be the sort of the point we keep coming back to in the story.
I was curious when they were putting the book together. There are a lot of characters, and the nice thing about it is like, oh, if you forget about one of them, it doesn't matter as long as you have the center. But I was curious. I did look up, because it wasn't in the advanced copy. So when I got my finished copy, which is, by the way, beautiful, with beautiful, not every, you're thinking you just got yours and you're like, oh, I guess all American books are this quality. They are not. This is really high quality paper. This book will not turn yellow in a year or even 3 months the way so many books are. They just did a spectacular job.
I know, and it's got those, I don't know what that's
called. Oh,
called.
that's a Knopf special, the rough cut.
Yeah,
Yes.
I love that.
Yeah. People, this is a great meditation technique to just rub your hands along the edge of it. But I'm curious, did they think about putting a cast of characters, dramatis personae, in it? Because I thought I would see one, but then I just read another, like, I'm just full of torture, and I just read The Love Songs of W.B. Du Bois, which is like 800 pages by Honoré Fanon-Jeffers, and there's a 4-page list of characters, and by the time I got to the third one, I'm like, I don't know how to read this book. I'm not going to know these people. So did they think about that? Because I expected one, and then I thought, oh, maybe I don't need one. So I'm wondering if there was back and forth about that.
No, I don't think there was back and forth with the publishers. I know I thought about it, but because I do like it. I like a book with a map. I like a book with a character list. I like a book with a family tree. These are all things that I like. So I definitely did think about a dramatis. I don't know quite how to pronounce the second bit. A list of characters.
I'm the worst pronouncer in the entire world, so don't worry. I say personae. It's wrong, and that's fine. I have no pride. So
but
you should.
Thank you. But I kind of ruled it out because I thought it would actually give you spoilers. I thought if you're going to see where you're going. Yeah. So that was my reasoning.
But
I have to say, yes.
Fairly easy.
Yeah.
What, sorry?
I said it's fairly easy to keep track.
Yeah, I think I hope so. Yeah.
Okay, Daniel, I interrupted.
I have a lot of notes. I do have to say the only way this book could be improved would be to have an end paper map of Dorset, because I might have to have a professional artist draw one in my book, because you do such a great job with place. It's a part of the country that I really know very little about, and I really did a deep dive into it. And you do live around there?
Yeah. I'll tell you something else though. One of the things I did think, which I don't think I ever mentioned to the publisher, was I was going to draw a map in the style of a child drawing a map. So that would have been quite fun.
One of Krista's maps.
Exactly. No, Dorset is where we moved here when I was 7. I lived in London till then, and then moved down with my family when I was 7. And I think the fact I was kind of a newcomer really made it really exciting to me, because I've been reading like Swallows and Amazons and those kind of books where kids explore the countryside, and then I was suddenly put into the countryside. So I got my bike and I set off to make my own maps and all of that sort of thing. But it is quite, it's most famous for being in Thomas Hardy's novels. It's Wessex in Thomas Hardy's, and it is still very rural. You do have lots of fields and beautiful beaches and thatched cottages and manor houses and all of that sort of stuff. And then also in the book, obviously you follow through into the Second World War, and then Dorset had an interesting history in the Second World War because so many American troops were stationed here. I think it was 80,000-90,000, something like that, because they set off a D-Day from the ports here. So it's a lovely place. You should come.
I feel like I've been there though, because the descriptions really are, you sort of are removed from today and just you fall back into the woods and you're down sliding into the area of the beach and up on the cliff or the chalk cliffs. It's beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So with the structure of the novel, you've got it broken into 5 different. So it's, like we were talking about, you're doing multiple things. So I'm going to piggyback and you can go on to this, Daniel. You're introducing sort of multiple kinds of novels with the historical and espionage. But I really love the way you bring in so much of the the theater and the putting it into acts like that. Was that something you started out with, or you want to talk a bit about the structure?
Yeah, again, a lot of these things, it would be easy to claim I had the idea all along, but I didn't. None of them kind of came in the writing of the book. I always knew that the children were going to be interested in the theatre, because seemed quite obvious to me that lonely posh kids in a big house who aren't being looked after are going to use their imagination to keep themselves occupied. So putting on plays seemed just something that I thought they would do. That felt quite nice. And then that it was just sort of a theme that I kept returning to. So in the 1920s, the house becomes a sort of party house for some bohemians. And when I was looking at magazines and newspapers from that time, you quite often see photographs of lord and lady such and such entertaining guests on their lawn, and they're doing a theatrical. So they've all dressed up and put on costumes. So it seemed to be quite a trendy thing at that time to put on some gauzy wings and do Midsummer's Night's Dream in your garden. So that fitted quite nicely with the 1920s section. And then it was nice to think about theatre through war, to find out where theatre was still going on during the war, and to have also the children create their own theatre. So it all sort of was all in there. And then I don't even know if it was my idea, but somebody had the idea to have it in 5 acts. So it mimics the shape of a Shakespearean play. And that it just fitted nicely. Yeah, it sort of tied everything together.
And it becomes sort of that frame, like instead of your contemporary frame, the theater becomes the frame of the book.
Yeah.
Lisa and I were talking about this, and I was talking about how you kind of played on so many different kinds of genres, and some like historical epics and espionage novels, and some like theater novels. And I was just thinking about how many theater novels I have read, and especially ones about children theater. There's a wonderful old book called Lives of the Circus Animals that I return to a lot, and one that I just read that I was trying to get Lisa to read, and then I got to one point, I said, oh, I might be too much for her, called Cyclorama, which is also about 2 presentations of Anne Frank, one in the 90s and one today. And but I just love that. I love the way you sort of, the whole, because it's also like and I don't think I'm giving anything away here, but the kids when they're young wind up still performing, so to speak, when they're adults.
Yeah. It was always quite well, there's all sorts of ideas to do with role playing and having to pretend to be a certain way that sort of read through the book. And I was particularly interested in the fact that these kids come from a certain class, a certain English upper class traditional house, which means there are strict expectations about who they are going to be. They have to be the heir to the manor if they're male. They have to be you have to make a good marriage if they're female. There are certain roles that they're expected to fill. So there's already that idea of, here is an identity that you're going to take on, sort of. And then again, like you say, in wartime, there's the opportunity to try out an entirely different way of living. If you work undercover, you get to become somebody else. You take on another name. And for my character Digby, I think without giving too much away, it's fairly safe to say that that's a real opportunity for him, because in England, he's the heir to the manor. He would have to be just doing English upper class things, whereas the war, in a weird way, for all of them is an opportunity to experience things they would never ordinarily experience. And he gets to live somewhere else, be somewhere else, and have a degree of freedom that he wouldn't ordinarily have, I think. So yeah, that kind of, the idea of sort of making believe, but also sort of being resistant to the roles you're expected to play, I think. Yeah.
If I may, just one more thing before I pass to Lisa, the class, like the class that they're in makes it very difficult for them to experiment. I was just thinking about how much teenagers and young adults get to sort of try on different hats, but I did note this book is so much about class, but I did note that there's a little, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a little fantasy element. They seem to be able to traverse class with a little more finesse than some people might.
Well, it's interesting as well, because I did think, oh, these kids are not, their upbringing is quite unusual.
And
So
that would probably
they,
do it. Yeah.
yeah, so they're the people who work as servants in the house, they're very familiar with them and they know them almost like family members, I would say. And then also in the 1920s, where there is this kind of Bohemian house guests coming and going, they're being exposed to lots of different people. I think it still would be weird to join the military if you've lived that kind of sheltered life and find yourself suddenly, you know, having to share quarters with a whole range of different people. And there's a bit when Christabel and Digby are together at some point during the war where you see that they don't know how to cook anything. They don't know how to boil pasta. So I did try and kind of give you little sort of clues that these are people who've had things done for them. But I also think that the measure of kind of the fact they were so neglected as children has also meant that they're not quite as sheltered as other English upper class kids would have been.
And their curiosity leads them into places, like the freedom leads them into places of self-discovery or adventure, but yet their breadth of knowledge is so limited because they haven't gone into school in the same way, which really is an interesting comparison. I like that, because it opens up, you know, that space for Christabel to sort of question all of those norms.
Yeah.
And some of her questioning and her conversations about why things are and why that person can do that and I can't do that if it's only based on this were wonderful. I mean, you just want to take out those passages and read them to everybody and say, look at this is what we should be talking about.
Yeah, they have, well, I think I say at one point that their education is made up of the books that they've read, and their books are very, very limited. They're literally what they can find. So they've kind of pieced together a weird kind of patchwork of facts, which are sort of true, but mainly not, about the world. And then kind of develop that kind of almost like a fantasy world almost between them. And that's how they understand the world. So when they actually go out into it, particularly in Christabel's case, she's very confident, but she's kind of socially naive. She's not really been anywhere. She hasn't been to, I mean, I think she sort of puts up with parties that happen in her own house, but she hasn't gone to school. She hasn't got any friends. She's completely isolated in that way. So yeah, when she comes up against things that perhaps other people accept because it's social norms, she does question them. And she's very logical as a child. Yeah. And that was fun to write, someone who's sort of pure logic in a way, very straightforward, to have her butt up against the slightly ridiculous traditions and customs that surround her.
And Rosalind too, with her love of magazines and setting her life, you know, her compass is set on the pictures in the magazines. She is limited in how she sees things too.
Yeah, and that sort of harks back to what we were saying about roles. Like Rosalind's, again, her life is a very narrow funnel. She's bred to be married, and all the men she could have married have just died in the First World War, and she has no education. She can't get a career. Her only chance of any kind of autonomy-ish is to marry, and so she ends up in an unsuitable marriage, and is unhappy. But she sees in the magazines these pictures of sort of bright young things, socialites, and she thinks, oh, that's what I could be, that's what I should be. And she's trying very hard to replicate that in a very damp old house in a rural county, very far away from anybody glamorous, with a husband who's really not interested in it. But yeah, so it is that kind of narrowed expectations. Yeah.
Both Lisa and I really liked the non-traditional storytelling elements, the sort of found documents, the diaries, some of which are fairly common in books, but others were not, as well as the word picture, the word poems. Were you, once again, was that in the original writing, or was that in the editing? Where did the inspiration for those come from?
They were there pretty much from the word go. I always wanted it to feel a bit like a collage. I think possibly it was born from almost like a nervousness that I was writing. The country house story and the war story are two things that are quite familiar to people. So I think I was always nervous that I was just going to lose people's attention fairly quickly because they thought it was going to be same thing done again. So at every opportunity I was trying to think, how can I do this in a way that would be interesting or unexpected, or how can I come at this from a weird angle? And so if moving words around a page is something I used to write poetry a million years ago, but that felt quite natural. The kind of clippings and things was quite fun to do, like newspaper clippings and magazine clippings, because when I was reading them, when I was doing my research, particularly the magazines, I enjoyed the language so much, and you get a real flavour of the society you're thinking about just by reading like the small ads for things. So I thought, I'd really love to include some of this, because it's like the texture of people's lives. And then it gives me a chance to do some sort of fun writing around that as well. But yeah, I think it was always in there from the beginning. And so whenever I had an opportunity, or I sort of spied an opportunity, I would go for it.
I thought the shape poem at that particular time, in that particular location, with that incident, because we can't give anything away, was brilliant. It used the format, it brought in the avant-garde, all of that. I was just like, oh, that's it. Did anyone else see that? That's brilliant. So kudos. How long have you been working on it? Because there's so many small pieces, there's so much texture, there's these little details and repetition that comes through that doesn't come quickly.
No, yeah. I think I had an idea for something along the lines of the book, probably about 10 years ago. And I'd just done a master's in creative writing. And a friend of mine who'd done the master's had gone on to do a PhD in creative writing. And I'm not lazy, but I work best within a structure, and I work best when I've got a deadline and someone to show work to. So I thought, oh, if I do a PhD, that provides that structure. So I toddled along to my interview with my PhD supervisor, enormously pregnant. This is how I can date my book. And said, I've got this, I think I might do this. And he said, okay, let's do that. And that was, my daughter's 9. So that's how I can sort of date it, 9 or 10 years ago. And I just did it like that in very small chunks. And I had a baby and I had a job. So I had to do it in small chunks. But I do think, like you say, I think that it benefited for that long gestation, no pun intended. I think it made me a better writer, because I was a better writer at the end than I was at the beginning, really, because I've been working on this thing for so long, and it gave me time it just brought more to the table, really. Like I had a whale in it. I'd read this really interesting fact about if a whale washes up on the shores of England, it's owned by the monarch by right. And this law still stands, apparently. So that, if you find a whale.
I was completely obsessed with that and did a deep dive. And then it took a detour into sturgeon. And I think a British author came and there's like, you had sturgeon in the supermarket. I'm like, oh, come on, you can buy sturgeon. And then it's really fat. Yeah, it is great. And I know several people on the call are booksellers and they've read it, but if you could just mention a little detail about the whale.
Yeah, sure. I can't just mention the whale and zip past it. Now, I read this fact, a really good non-fiction book called The Wreckers by a writer called Bella Bathurst, which is all about shipwrecks and things that wash up and who owns them. And the whale is owned by the monarch by right. And at that time, I was doing a writing workshop, and a writer said to us, I want you to write a scene which sums up a lot of the themes that you're thinking about in your book. So I thought, the fact that the whale is owned by the king, but Christabel thinks it's hers, but it's not hers, that's unfair. That's kind of the thing I'm thinking about, sort of entitlement and tradition and all that stuff. So I had the whale, and I put it on my beach in my book, and then I carried on writing it. And I just, at the back of my mind, I kept thinking, I've got to do something with a whale. It's like Chekhov's gun, but like on a massive scale. And it was just there rotting on the beach. And I couldn't think what to do with it for ages. And then I went to see Kate Bush in concert, which is a bit of a segue, I know, but she had an amazing stage set which looked like the ribs of a galleon or the ribs of a whale. And it looked amazing as a stage set. And I thought, children could make it into a whale. And then of course you kind of go, oh yeah, because I've seen in a few random places the skeletons of whales used as things outside in sort of sculptural ways. So it makes sense that the kids would create theatre out of it. So hence the Whalebone Theatre.
You heard that Kate Bush's next single is called the Whalebone Theatre. Right?
Yeah, I thought it might be. Yeah.
It's the whole plot of the book. The only problem with the song is it's 3 hours and 20 minutes.
Especially director's cut, yeah.
That's right. She got it into a 3.5 minute single, mostly just chorus.
Yeah.
Your book is like I said, so many things, but it is a World War II novel. Those are so interesting because there are so many of them. It is like one of the few moments in history for both British people and Americans where you're like, okay, I think we're on the right side of that one. And nowadays it's so hard to know, or you often know that you have to write a nuanced and problematic story for somebody. How did you take that? What were the different ways that you thought, I'm doing this, but I'm making it my own? Like, what were the things that you wanted to do?
It's weird when you just said that about the clarity of which side you should be on. I sometimes think that's why we like films and books about World War II, just because it's so clear. And it's arguably maybe the last time that happened, that there was a bad guy and we knew we should be on that. Yeah. But yeah, so when I went in thinking about the war, I've always read a lot of social history about the war. It was an interest I shared with my dad. We would read quite niche history books about the siege of Stalingrad and things like that for fun. So I've always known quite a lot about it, but I didn't know about women who served in the Special Operations Executive until fairly recently. And for people who don't know, it was a branch of the military that was set up specifically during the Second World War. And it was very unique in that it took civilians, basically, recruited people mainly for their language skills. So if they could speak the language of the country they were due to go into, they got recruited, and it used women. And it gave them like a fast track commando training thing that lasted not very, very long, sort of a few months. And then off you went, you were parachuted into France. And you worked with like local resistance groups to provide them with weapons and get people organized and blow up bridges and things like that. And I just loved that. I loved that it wasn't a part of the war story that I knew very well, and I loved that there were women involved, quite often young, very brave women. And I just thought, yeah, I'm going to think about that because that's fun for me. And it fitted quite well with my story that Christabel should be that kind of person. And I suppose the other angle that I got really interested in, which again came quite late in my research, was the fact that some of the wartime story takes place in occupied Paris. And I was reading about cultural life in occupied Paris, and I discovered that the theatres still stayed open. And when I was reading about the fact that the theatres, I thought, oh, that's interesting. I love that. That's so good. Because if I'm going to have my characters in Paris in war, they're going to go to the theatre if they're open, because they love the theatre. So then I was rummaging around trying to find out more about theatres, and I read that they put on this new production of Antigone by a French playwright whose name I can't pronounce, but it's something like Onwil. And this production was a smash hit. And what was really interesting was that it was popular with both the German occupiers that were in the city and the French people who lived there. They all wanted to see it. And that was just so exciting to me, to find something that was real, but also seemed to fit perfectly with what I was doing. And again, I didn't know of any books that had done theatre in wartime, or at least theatre in France in wartime. So those two things, which I felt, it's always hard to judge because I've read a lot of wartime books. So I think, do people know this or don't they know this? But I felt both things were sufficiently interesting to try and make that part of the book fun and interesting for people to read.
But then you've got to combine with the World War II or the World War I history moving through and the manners. So you've got a totally different thing going than just a World War II novel.
Yeah. And also you have, I forgot to mention her, poor Flossie, but one of my characters stays at home in Dorset. And that was quite a nice, fun kind of counterpoint to the more active wartime stuff, that she's learning to be a different person in a different way through taking over the house and hosting musical evenings and things like that. But yeah, and I felt, I don't know, I hoped that it was more a family saga that included World War II than a World War II novel, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And your characters all, I think about them all. I mean, they have each a different point. Like you give them one perspective, but then later, like with Jasper, we've got one thing and you're just like, oh, oh. But then you reveal a different side to him, and you manage to do that with many of your characters. Maudie is an interesting one too, where she is there growing up with the kids, but then, it's got her own stuff going on, and which we see in Diaries, which is a private thing.
Yeah. I think again, a lot of that was my being aware that what I was doing was familiar fictional territory. So to always, if I ever felt that I was approaching any kind of cliche, like the grumpy patriarch and, in the big house, that's fairly familiar, to try and sort of make that character more of a kind of 360 character, so you understand why he is, and it being fun for the reader that sometimes those things don't come all together, that you have one side of someone and then you learn another side of someone. I was talking to someone the other day about my mad love for the TV series 6 Feet Under. And one of the things I loved about that TV series is that my favorite character at the beginning was not my favorite character at the end. It's just like your opinions. I think it's just a sign of a good bit of fiction, good bit of storytelling, that the characters change and your opinion of them change all the way through. And Maudie was also really, really fun to write. And I wanted there to be not just upper class voices in the house for you to hear the voices of the servants too. So you get Maudie and her diaries, where she doesn't hold back in those particularly. And her journey is an interesting one as well, because the war is an opportunity for the upper class characters to experience all kinds of things, but it's also an opportunity for the lower working class characters to have jobs and to serve in the military and to leave this can't think what the word is, hierarchy, and find a new role for themselves.
Yeah.
I love books that kind of make, change perspective, and you realize that that you've been sort of taken by another character's perspective. It came to mind. Did you ever read the book Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff?
No, I haven't. I've heard about it though.
Yeah, I think it actually got published in Great Britain. It did pretty well here, but it's a 2-part book, and one's from the male perspective and the other's from the female. And you're just
nice.
like, it just explodes you.
I like that as well.
Yeah. I think Carol Shields did a book like that too.
Carol Shields, that's right. Not Anti, it's a quilting convention novel.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Pamela, we have a few questions. We also have more questions too. But Pamela Klingerhorn, our bookseller friend, wants to know about when writing Christabel. Did she lead you in different directions in writing than you wanted to go in terms of the story?
Christabel, the challenge with Christabel was not so much that. I kind of knew where she was going to go, and she's very definite and she's a very forward-moving character. The thing that I kind of went back and worked on was the bits where you see her being vulnerable, and I learned that as I went along. She can't just always be the leader. She can't always be indomitable. There have to be moments where you see her struggling and you see her out of place. So, like thinking about the start of Act 3, where you see her as a young adult for the first time, and she's at a party, and it's really uncomfortable having to wear a dress and heels, and so it was those moments that I went back and put in. It was more Christabel ill at ease, so you feel that she's not just she's not just a bulletproof leader. There are vulnerabilities and confusions in her as well.
When I was reading, I kept thinking of the Ogden Nash poem. Do you know The Adventures of Isabel?
No, I don't know that one.
Oh, I'm going to post it. It's wonderful. It reminds me very much of Christabel.
Okay.
Lisa, you should read a few, like a little bit from it too.
All right. So Isabel met an enormous bear. Isabel didn't care. The bear was hungry. The bear was ravenous. The bear's big mouth was cruel and cavernous. The bear said, "Isabel, glad to meet you. How do, Isabel? Now I'll eat you." Isabel didn't worry. Isabel didn't scream or scurry. She washed her hands and she straightened her hair up. Then Isabel quietly ate the bear up. And it goes on like that throughout. And it just reminded me to have that sort of verb as a young child, reminded me of of Christabel.
Yeah, very much so. That's great.
Yeah. I was convinced you had read this, and it was written in 1932, which is like the perfect time period for
Yeah.
that.
No,
Yeah.
I have not heard that one, but thank you for that.
Yeah, feel free to recite it at your other events.
Yes, please do, because there's even the one about the witch and the raker, and she turned her into milk and drank her.
I like that.
I'm curious, when you were writing, you know, we're going to ask you about your books that you like, but this is a different kind of book question. Were there, you know, sometimes when we talk to authors, sometimes they say, I want to write a book that's like nothing I've ever read before, which is, you did want to do your own take on it. But were there any books or authors who did inspire you when you said, I want, you know, as inspirations for this book?
I think there were kind of two categories, really. One is sort of the accidental inspirations, which I think it's books that I loved, particularly as a kid, that have just kind of embedded themselves in me and then come out as I was writing. And so I wasn't aware of them as I was writing, but when I look back, I can see, oh, that's a bit like even just recently, I was reading Ballet Shoes by Noel Stratfield with my daughter. And I was reminded in that of these kids who want to be in the theatre. And I thought, wow, maybe that was like a seed somewhere in the back of my head. But a lot of novels by children's nonfiction by the writer E. Nesbit, I loved as a child. I was just addicted. And I suspect there's a lot of that in there. Another writer called Lucy M. Boston, who wrote a series of books called The Children of Green Know, which is, again, children in a big house. I was just obsessed with those as a child. So I suspect that's buried in my subconscious somewhere, fermenting away. In terms of inspirations for the book like that I was conscious of, it was more that I really love big fat books that cover a time span. So like Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Consolver, or the Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. That kind of style of book where it's just a story that you are living in from beginning to end, and it covers a long period of time, goes from childhood to adulthood. So that was kind of, and that, again, that's based on my own love of them rather than any kind of academic theorizing.
That's the best reason of all.
Yeah. Yes,
I was so reminded of like the orphan trope, but I just want to say, as a person who obsessively read E. Nesbit, I don't know if these transitioned across the pond, but did you ever read the Edward Eager books? They're all from the early 60s.
No, I don't think so.
One is inspired by a different E. Nesbit book, and they're all about children dealing with magic, and funny and way. They had a little bit of a pop during the witching school sort of renaissance, but they're very different because they're funny, but they're completely, you can tell that E. Nesbit was by far his favorite writer. 7 books.
Oh, hunt them down.
Oh, so great. So great. How old are you? What kind of kids? What kids are we talking about? What age?
What, mine?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, she's 9, so she's perfect Nesbit age. Yeah.
Okay, Lisa.
We started with the railway.
I'm gonna say for when she's about 15, Sweetness at the Bottom of the Pie is another great big house, unsupervised child who is obsessed with chemistry. I love that one.
Nice.
It's a wonderful mystery. It's an adult novel, but it reads perfect for teens. Mm-hmm. So now we're not talking about books, we're asking more questions.
Well, let's ask Jason Gobble's question.
I didn't see it. Sorry,
one
Jason.
of the things I love about this novel is not just the main characters who are given full lines. So while not everyone has their full story told, it feels like everyone has a full story, which seems especially amazing in a debut novel. Were there authors' books that you particularly loved that did similar things that inspired you write this way, or did it just seem right for the book? And obviously, I think Cavalier and Clay is probably a good example of that.
Sorry, you went a little bit crackly then. I missed the middle of the question.
He just was like a little more. What led you to write this sort of novel that had so many full, rich characters?
I think it's just that I like it. I've just always and again, I think it has a lot to do with childhood imagination and childhood play. But in my head, the book was almost like a big doll's house that I opened the doors of, and I was moving these people around. And it was so fun for me to like take this character and put it over here and see how they get on. And just, it felt like playing. And it was, the more I could do of it, the more fun it was. And to flesh out characters who were even just small characters who you get for a bit, to make them fully 3D was just was part of the fun of it, really, I think. And I hope that it pays off, because it does mean if you are in a big book with lots of characters that does cover a lot of time, you want these people to be solid and believable. Otherwise they just become names that kind of flash past your peripheral vision and you go, who was that again? I can't remember.
Well,
So
what did the Sunday Times reviewer say? Pure heaven from the first word to the last.
Yeah.
So I think it worked there.
Yeah. And we haven't really talked about the whole creative side that runs through all of this, from the sense of wonder and curiosity, because they all have sort of a creative talent that comes out, and Taras is sort of pulls that forward. But with this novel taking as long as it did for you too, like you, not as long, but the fact that you were writing and had these other lives going on at the same time, I thought of this scene, and this isn't going to be a spoiler, where they're in the attic room and Krista has her own little private writing space that the siblings don't know about. And just the whole creative process coming through, did you consciously kind of like want them to have that based on just, I don't know, we don't often see that backside growth to somebody's life, the creative life like that. And that Taras brought that forward. Like, I can see in you that you are this.
Yeah, I think, I'd read a lot about Bohemian artisty type people in the 1920s. There's one really good book called Among the Bohemians by Virginia Nicholson, which I read. And I'd also read a biography of the painter Augustus John, who lived in that sort of time. And there's quite a lot of Augustus John in Taras, who's my Russian artist. And I thought it would be really interesting to see these sort of Bohemians living this free lifestyle from the point of view of children. I just thought that was a fun kind of collision to happen. So for Chris, so you see them quite, you see their foibles when you're looking at them through a child's eyes, but also there is, Taras, I think, says that he finds children inspiring and he wants to hear more from their point of view. And for Christabel, I think he's probably one of the first people who takes us seriously. And it's just fun to bring in these outside characters and have them bring out things in the children that they might not ordinarily have brought out of them. And yeah, he is important because he takes her seriously, and it's almost like he never treats her as a child. He always treats her as a small adult. and he encourages her to believe in her own work, and he's always pushing her, actually. And as a girl, she wouldn't have been educated, so she wouldn't even have a teacher. So he's super important for her. And yeah, and I think he says to her something like, you know, you started, or something, when she admits to that she's been writing stories. She says, this is how it begins, you know. So yeah.
So then you've also got then the novel about an artist, about that creative process going too, along with the espionage and the history.
Yeah, and in my mind, it's almost like, in my mind, Christabel has kind of absorbed the lessons of the children's books that she's read as a child, which were her dad's books. So they're very gung-ho, very Victorian, very militaristic. It's all about British soldiers conquering the world in various colonial ways. And so she believes in that kind of ideal of heroism. Her vision is a male one because that's what she's learned. So it makes sense for her to go into the war, and it makes sense for her to do pretty well in the war. But I think I wanted that journey to be for her to kind of find also the restrictions of that worldview, and she's not going to get very far, actually, if she carries on within that world. She's never going to be a general or a brigadier because she's a woman. It's just not going to happen for her. And for her, on the flip side, for her also to realize the value of the thing that she loved as a child, which is play acting and imagination. And I feel like that's a fairly common journey. We quite often have something that we love as children, but then we go into a job because we think we need the money and we need the wage, and maybe our parents did it, and oh no, we need to do this, we need to settle down. But maybe at some point later in life you go, actually, you know what, I really loved painting or gardening or whatever it was, and you kind of return to that thing that you loved originally. And in Christabel's case, it's the theatre. But yeah, it is that return to the imagination was important for me. Yeah.
We see it a lot with writers,
Yeah.
their second careers.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I feel like I was remiss in not asking one question that is, it's a bit of a cliched question, but it is so interesting for this book, is just about the research you did from it. Did you, I assume you did research, but there are writers who's like, I don't really do that much, and so much of this, the World War II story and the World War I story is like so embedded that you might not have to do very much. But then there was one particular incident where I thought, I think that's, and I can't say what it is because it's a twist. I thought, I think that's real because I think I read it in another book, and the coincidence of that happening twice seemed too unusual.
Yeah, no, I did have quite a lot of residual knowledge of First World War and Second World War. I think what you're thinking about probably is real. There are
Okay.
a couple of, yeah. If it happens in a nightclub, yeah, it is.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
it did.
Yeah,
Preceded by a poem.
yeah. And there are a couple of real things, like that thing is a real thing. Some of the war things are real things. The play at the end is a real thing. And those where it was based on something real, I did do the proper deep dive research into those things. I also did quite a lot looking at newspapers and magazines, particularly local, in my local library, in my local reference library, where there's sort of self-published memoirs from people who lived through the war, and you get lovely detail in there. Lots of Maudie's wartime experiences came from those self-published memoirs. And I did a lot of fact-checking things, which are sometimes fun, sometimes not, but checking against dates, making sure I had all my sort of dates lined up, food, clothes, trains, that kind of thing. Those sort of details need to be checked. But somebody suggested to me, and it's a really good tip for anyone who's thinking of doing historical novels, to read novels that were published at the time, so contemporary novels about that time, which is really fun. So I read like Dorothy L. Sayers and Rosamund Lehman and other writers in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And in there, you just get lovely details and language and stuff that you don't necessarily get in the history book. So I did a lot of that too, and called that research. But yeah, it was fun. And it kind of went, my rule for myself was if I was too tired to write, I could always read a book. And I like reading books. So it wasn't that hard.
For work.
Well, and the language is so much fun. The phrasing and just the quirky words, it is a great one to read out loud.
Yeah, I've heard the audiobook is really good. I haven't listened to it myself yet, but I've heard she does a great job.
Yeah, but I'm a big fan of reading out loud when I read to myself, because it changes. I love the feel of the language by reading it. Yeah, it just changes. So if anyone ever reads to a spouse or a companion, this is perfect.
Yeah, I did read it. When I'm editing, I always read out loud. And I was vaguely conscious, particularly in the summer when the windows are open, that my neighbors would just hear me doing these really very bad Russian accents.
And then one day you look out the window and there are people lined up with chairs, kind of appreciative of the show.
Yeah, especially the scenes where there's some scenes, know that there are some scenes where they're putting on plays. So I was doing like a gazillion different voices. Yeah. I think I'm having some kind of nervous breakdown in my house. Yeah.
Lisa, I think it's time for your reading question.
My reading question. All right. So we like to wrap up with, what have you been reading lately and what would you recommend?
Okay, so I've got two. I've read, it's very rare for me to read anything on the Booker shortlist, but I have managed it this year. And I've read Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, who's an Irish writer. She's written a lot of short stories, which are amazing. I think I'm right in saying this is her first novel. It's very slim. It's like a novella, really. And it's a little bit Christmassy. It has echoes of A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens in it, but it's quite dark. It's hard to talk about without giving too much away. It's sort of feels like a fable, like a modern fable. You could read it in an evening, but it would just stay inside you. Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. She's
Everyone in the event has
incredible.
apparently read it, so.
Yeah,
Oh,
it is amazing.
Including both of us, we
Yeah.
would highly recommend it too. And for
Mhm.
those of you who count the number of books you read, it's an easy.
Amy.
You're competitive.
My other one would be, I had COVID earlier this year, which was okay. I didn't get it that badly, but just enough that I had to lie down for a long period of time, which was semi-enjoyable. But I read The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, which is the third part of her Thomas Cromwell trilogy in that time. And it was just, I mean, I am and always will be a Hilary Mantel fangirl, but the whole weight of that trilogy, the culmination of it, it's just the best piece of historical fiction, best piece of fiction, maybe, I don't know, in the 20th century. It's just immense. It's like she actually is Thomas Cromwell. I'm fairly convinced she time traveled. It's just it's an incredible piece of work, and it's such a shame that she's no longer with us. But the books are amazing, and I'm going to reread them all now. Yeah.
You'd be like, yes, once a year, you'll read all 3 of them.
Yeah.
And maybe get something else done.
Okay, before we go though, before you wrap up, Daniel, I want to say that you also put together a playlist that's on your website, and there's some great music that goes along with the book, and I am copying it and I'm going to paste it in the chat. And if you open it up, folks, you can listen, or you can go to Joanna's website.
Yeah, and if I would open it now, so it'll be there after we go. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say there's notes on the playlist as well, sort of linked from that bit, where you can read about the historical, because I'm such a nerd, you can read about the historical context of the songs, if that's your thing.
I think it's all our things, yes.
It's all of us.
People.
And it's a great selection too.
Yeah, it was fun to do. It was procrastination, pure and simple, but it was good fun. Yeah.
Like reading the period novels. You're like,
Yes.
this is my reading today.
Yeah.
My work today.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. For those attending, we will have a recording up soon, and please share it with friends. We'd love for everybody to, if they're not in the Read with Jenna book club, there's another option for them. But or maybe you're like me and you'll watch every interview that you do, probably. So.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you so much for having me. It's been fun. Really enjoyed it.
It has. It's been a delight, and it's such a wonderful book. I cannot wait to keep handing it out this fall.
Likewise.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye,
Thanks
everybody.
everyone for coming.